The words hit me like a physical blow, slicing through the carefully constructed illusion of my marriage. "I can't believe I ever lowered myself enough to marry you," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You were never and will never be anywhere near my level." My world shattered right there in our dining room. It was a Tuesday night in October, a night that should have been a celebration. I stood there, wearing the dress I'd chosen for the occasion, my heart swelling with pride. Just hours earlier, my school had named me Teacher of the Year after 6 long years of pouring my soul into teaching second graders. I had meticulously prepared a special dinner: pan-seared salmon, just the way Ryan's mother taught me, roasted asparagus, and a $40 bottle of the Cabernet he loved, a significant chunk of my weekly grocery budget. Our wedding china, usually reserved for holidays, gleamed under the soft glow of expensive, non-smoking candles. This dinner, this evening, was supposed to be about us, about sharing my joy. But Ryan came home 3 hours late. He barely glanced at the beautifully set table, the flickering candles, the food that was now cooling. Instead, he delivered what he clearly considered an overdue correction to our marriage. He laid out new ground rules. "From now on, I'll decide when we talk or spend time together. Stop chasing me like a desperate puppy." He compared our salaries, my $48,000 as a teacher against his impending partnership at a prestigious law firm, as if human worth could be measured on a spreadsheet. He declared we were not equals. Then, without another word, he walked past me, into his office, and closed the door. The click of that door shutting echoed the finality in his voice, leaving me alone with cold salmon and dying candles. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't knock on that door demanding answers. Instead, a cold, clear feeling settled inside me, like ice forming on a winter lake. If he truly believed marrying me had been lowering himself, if he wanted silence and distance, then I would give him exactly what he asked for. I would honor his request with such perfect compliance that in just 2 weeks he would be standing in my school lobby, holding roses, begging for the woman he thought he had broken. By the way, if you're still with me, make sure to hit subscribe. More unbelievable stories are coming. But before we dive into that confrontation, I need to back up and explain how we arrived at that heartbreaking moment. His cruelty that night wasn't some sudden explosion. It had been building for months, small cuts I kept making excuses for, explaining away, until they accumulated into something I could no longer ignore. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing that dinner with such careful attention, hoping to reignite a spark, to share my achievement. I wanted Ryan to look at me with the pride he used to, like in our first year when he'd introduce me as the best thing that ever happened to him. I wanted him to be proud of me, just as I'd been proud of him when he passed the bar, when he won his first big case, when people started talking about him as partnership material. 6:30 came and went. Then 7, then 9. The salmon was losing its perfect texture, the asparagus softening, the candles burning down. I texted twice, worried, ignored. By 9, worry had morphed into a bitter resignation. This wasn't new. For 6 months, he'd been late, distant, always with the excuse of work pressure, the all-consuming partnership review. I told myself important clients needed attention. Big cases required late nights. I constructed elaborate justifications for behavior that, deep down, I knew was just plain disrespect, disguised as professional obligation. When the door finally opened at 9:30, I stood up from the dining room table, a brief, irrational flicker of hope lighting in my chest. Maybe he'd apologize. Maybe he'd notice the effort. Maybe we could salvage the evening. But Ryan walked in, impeccably dressed in his Tom Ford suit, tie loosened, eyes glued to his phone. He didn't look up. He didn't see the table, smell the food, or notice the candles. He just walked past the dining room, heading for his home office, his thumbs flying across his screen in that constant typing motion that had become more familiar to me than his touch. I moved quickly, stepping into the hallway before he could disappear behind that closed door. The words about my award, the gala, the recognition, tumbled out of me in a rush, bright and eager, a desperate plea for him to care, to acknowledge, to show even a tiny sign that my accomplishments mattered. He held up one hand without looking at me. That gesture, small and dismissive, was worse than anything he said later. It was the way you'd silence an interruption, wave off a waitress, when you're in a conversation that actually matters. He stopped, finally looked up from his phone, and I saw not interest or pride, but irritation. Annoyance that I had delayed him from whatever he considered more important. What came next was delivered in the clinical, precise, utterly devoid of warmth voice he probably used with opposing counsel. He told me we needed new ground rules. The phrase sounded rehearsed. He said he would decide when we talked. I needed to stop chasing him around like a desperate puppy. It was exhausting and frankly beneath both of us. He paused, loosening his tie, his phone still clutched in his other hand. He hadn't stopped looking at his screen, as if restructuring our marriage didn't even merit his full attention. Then came the part that would replay in my mind every sleepless night, the words that would redefine everything. He said he could not believe he had ever lowered himself enough to marry me, that I was never and would never be anywhere near his level. He laid it out with the precision of a lawyer presenting evidence. I was a second-grade teacher, $48,000 a year. He was making partner, triple my salary. We are not equals, he declared, and I'm tired of pretending we are. It was delivered as fact, as if my worth as a human being could be calculated by comparing incomes and finding me catastrophically insufficient. Then he walked past me, into his office, and closed the door. The click echoed through our home with terrible finality. I stood there, paralyzed, my mind struggling to process. From behind his closed door, I heard the faint murmur of his voice on a phone call, probably with a colleague, conducting business that mattered more than the wife he had just demolished. I walked slowly back to the dining room. The cold salmon on our wedding china, the soft asparagus, the expensive wine, the burning low candles. Everything looked different now. His words had transformed my hopeful celebration into evidence of my foolishness, my fundamental inadequacy. I didn't cry that night. That surprised me later because tears would have been the natural response. But instead of grief or heartbreak, something else arrived uninvited. It was cold, clear, and merciless like water freezing into ice. The man I had married, the man whose last name I carried, the man I had supported through law school by working 2 jobs, taking out loans, sacrificing my own financial security, had just told me I would never be good enough. That my worth was a spreadsheet, our marriage an act of charity on his part. Standing in that dining room, staring at his closed office door, I made a decision. If Ryan wanted silence, if he wanted to decide when we communicated, if he truly believed I was so far beneath him, then I would give him exactly what he asked for. I would honor his request with such perfect compliance that he would eventually realize the catastrophic error he had made. I would respect his boundaries so thoroughly that he would come to understand what his life actually looked like without the invisible support system I had been providing for 3 years. I moved through the dining room like someone performing a ritual for the last time. I cleared the table, wrapped the uneaten salmon, and put it in the fridge where it would sit untouched until I threw it away days later. I blew out the candles, watching the thin streams of smoke rise. I put away the wedding china, piece by piece, already knowing we would never use it together again. I picked up the $40 bottle of Cabernet and poured it down the kitchen sink, watching the dark liquid swirl away, a fitting symbol for the evening, and perhaps for our entire marriage. Then I walked upstairs to the guest room and closed that door, creating my own boundary in response to his. Sleep didn't come that night, but planning did. I lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking with surprising clarity. Despite the shock, Ryan had inadvertently given me something valuable. He had given me permission to stop trying, permission to stop walking on eggshells, permission to stop being the only person who cared if our marriage survived. He had declared the rules of engagement, and I would follow them with such perfect obedience that he would eventually understand what he had lost. The next morning, I woke before dawn, moving with a new purpose. I made coffee, but only 1 cup. I prepared breakfast, but only enough for 1 person. When Ryan emerged from our bedroom around 7, still adjusting his cufflinks and checking his phone, he stopped in the kitchen doorway, confusion briefly clouding his features. For 3 years, I had made his breakfast without fail. His egg white omelet, his whole wheat toast, his coffee just right. It was a routine he expected, like electricity when you flip a switch. I sat calmly at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee. I assumed you'd prefer to handle your own meals going forward. I told him, my voice polite, devoid of anger or sarcasm. Since you're so capable, and I'm apparently so far beneath your standards that my service is no longer required. My words seemed to confuse him even more than the absence of his breakfast. He opened his mouth to speak, then thought better of it. He grabbed his briefcase, which I would normally have placed on the counter with dry, cleaning receipts and reminders, and stood for a moment, looking around as if searching for something he couldn't quite identify. Then he left. I watched him go, no automatic kiss goodbye, no reminders about meetings. The door closed, and I sat alone, feeling the silence settle around me. That silence no longer felt uncomfortable or tense. Instead, it felt full of possibility. It felt like freedom. That first day of my strategic withdrawal was harder than I anticipated, but not for the reasons I expected. I didn't miss Ryan. I didn't feel lonely, sad, or regretful. What was hard was breaking 3 years of carefully constructed habits. My body had learned to operate a certain way, and now I was asking it to unlearn everything. At my desk, during recess, my hand reached for my phone, muscle memory compelling me to text Ryan. I stopped myself just before touching the screen, pulling my hand back as if the phone were hot. This happened repeatedly throughout the day. I decided to redirect that energy. I texted my sister, Claire. We hadn't spent quality time together in months because I was always doing something for Ryan. She responded with 3 exclamation points, saying she'd been worried about me and would love to catch up. Then I messaged Andrea, a friend I'd neglected because Ryan always needed something in the evenings. Andrea wrote back suggesting drinks on Friday. I even responded to an email from Jenna, the 5th grade teacher down the hall, whose lunch invitations I declined repeatedly. When I walked into the teacher's lounge that afternoon, Jenna's face brightened. We talked about nothing important, her Costa Rica vacation, a difficult parent conference, the new principal. I realized how much I'd missed this simple conversation with another adult about things unrelated to managing Ryan. When Jenna asked about my week, I told her about the Teacher of the Year award. Her reaction was everything Ryan's should have been. She squealed with excitement, grabbed my arm, and said I absolutely deserved it. When the bell rang, I felt lighter, as if the simple act of being seen and celebrated had released a pressure I didn't know I was carrying. By day 3, something shifted fundamentally. I woke up, went through my routine, and realized I hadn't thought about Ryan once. No wondering when he'd be home, no mentally reviewing his schedule, no checking my phone. The realization stopped me mid-motion, toothbrush still in my mouth. For the first time in 3 years, Ryan wasn't the background program constantly running in my mind. That day at school, I taught about the water cycle with genuine focus and enthusiasm, fully present. I helped settle a dispute between 2 boys with patience and humor, instead of the distracted efficiency I'd operated with for months. The mental space consumed by managing his requirements was suddenly available for other things. I felt physically lighter, as if a heavy backpack had been removed from my shoulders. During lunch with Jenna, I actually tasted my food. She noticed. "You seem different," she said, lighter. She asked if something good had happened. "Just making some life adjustments," I replied. She smiled, with the knowing expression of someone who understood that sometimes the best changes come from letting go of what weighs you down. The transformation accelerated. I started going to the gym before school again, a routine I'd abandoned because Ryan complained I was never home, despite leaving before 6 a.m. himself. Now I drove to the gym at 5:30, arriving at school energized. I reconnected with old friends. Andrea and I met for drinks, talking for 3 hours without me checking my phone once. I accepted a brunch invitation from my college friend, Melissa, without the automatic calculation of whether Ryan might need me. These friendships had been neglected, and I hadn't realized how isolated I'd become until I started rebuilding those bridges. On Wednesday evening of my second week, I did something I'd wanted to do for years. I signed up for a pottery class. It met every Wednesday from 6 to 8, time I would normally spend preparing elaborate dinners Ryan barely acknowledged. I walked into the studio, nervous yet excited, and met Margaret, the instructor, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and clay permanently under her fingernails. She had the kind of face that suggested she'd lived through difficult things and emerged stronger. Margaret welcomed me, showed me to a wheel, and demonstrated how to center clay. My first attempt was a disaster. She laughed kindly. Everyone starts there. It requires patience and a willingness to fail. Then she shared something personal. She'd been teaching pottery for 20 years after her second divorce, needing something that was entirely hers. Sometimes, she said, her eyes seeing more than I'd revealed, the best things we create come from the rubble of what we thought we wanted. Her words settled over me like a blessing. I worked the clay, building something new from the ruins of my marriage, something that would be entirely mine. On day 7, I made a terrifying but necessary decision. During my lunch break, I drove to a bank across town where Ryan would never go. Heart pounding, I opened a checking account in only my name, authorizing automatic transfers from my paycheck. Small amounts Ryan would never notice, building a financial safety net outside his knowledge or control. That same week, I scheduled a consultation with a divorce attorney. Patricia Reeves specialized in high-asset divorces. Her downtown office smelled of expensive leather and quiet power. Patricia listened to my story with the focused intensity of a predator calculating exactly how much my husband was going to pay for his arrogance. She took notes, asking about the student loans I took out to support him through law school, the 2 jobs I worked while he studied for the bar. She told me that in our state, his upcoming partnership and significant salary increase would be considered marital property, especially since I'd financially supported his education and early career. When she smiled at this information, it wasn't kind. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly how to make Ryan regret every cruel word he'd uttered. I left her office with a plan and a timeline. For the first time since that terrible Tuesday night, I felt something like hope. The changes in Ryan became visible around day 10. Subtle at first, but accumulating. During brief moments when our paths crossed, he looked disoriented. I'd hear him opening and closing cabinets in the kitchen, punctuated by long pauses, as if he couldn't remember where things were or why they weren't there. His favorite coffee mug gathered dust while I used my own, making only enough coffee for myself. He never asked me to make his coffee, never even mentioned the absence of the routine. But I saw the confusion in his posture, the way he stood for a few extra seconds, waiting for something to materialize that no longer would. The dry cleaning situation provided another source of bewilderment. Every Thursday for 3 years, I had picked up his shirts. Now, they hung unclaimed at the cleaner. I heard him on the phone with them, irritation mixed with confusion. The kitchen told its own story of deterioration. The groceries I used to purchase and organize according to his preferences were gone, replaced by items I wanted. He'd stare at the refrigerator contents as if written in a foreign language, searching for the prepared meals, the specific yogurt. I'd walk past him without offering help, maintaining the pleasant but distant demeanor you'd use with a housemate. One evening, near the end of that second week, Ryan actually broke the silence. I was in the living room, reading a thriller about a woman systematically destroying her abusive ex-husband's life. He came out of his office, watching me before speaking. "Is everything okay?" His voice carried a hint of uncertainty I'd never heard from him before, almost vulnerable. I looked up and smiled, the same pleasant distance I'd maintained since that terrible Tuesday night. "Everything's fine," I said. "I'm just respecting your boundaries, giving you the space you requested. You said you'd decide when we talked, so I'm simply waiting for you to decide." The logic was perfect, airtight. How could he possibly complain? He stood there, trying to find a flaw, his mouth opening and closing. Finally, he nodded and went back into his office. I returned to my book, feeling a small surge of satisfaction. The trap I had set was working exactly as intended. Day 12 brought a new development that confirmed my strategy was having its desired effect. My phone vibrated during lunch at school. Ryan's name appeared on the screen. I glanced at it briefly and declined the call without interrupting my conversation with Jenna. She caught my eye, raised her eyebrows slightly, but said nothing. She knew enough about my situation to understand what that represented. Later, as we walked back to our classrooms, she squeezed my arm. "You're doing great," she said. She didn't elaborate, and she didn't need to. That evening, my phone rang again during pottery class. My hands were covered in wet clay. Ryan's name. Without breaking my concentration, I returned to the wheel. Margaret, my instructor, noticed. She gave me an approving nod, the kind of acknowledgement that passes between women who understand what it takes to ignore a ringing phone when you've spent years jumping to answer every call. Over the next 2 days, Ryan called 6 more times. I answered none of them. Each ignored call felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself. On day 14, the calls stopped, and the text messages began. The first was brief and polite. "Are you okay?" I read it and put my phone down. An hour later, another message, expressing confusion about why I wasn't responding. The third, that evening, carried frustration. He didn't understand what was happening. My silence was making things worse. I read each message and deleted it. What could I possibly say that wouldn't undermine the perfect logic of my position? He told me to stop bothering him, so I stopped. He said he would decide when we communicated, so I was waiting. For him, the fact that his attempts to initiate contact didn't count as deciding was a nuance he apparently hadn't considered. By the end of the second week, the physical evidence of Ryan's deterioration became impossible to ignore. He'd stopped eating regular meals. Takeout containers accumulated in the kitchen. The man who insisted on home-cooked dinners was living on delivery. His dress shirts hung looser. Dark circles bruised his eyes. He wasn't sleeping well. I'd hear him pacing in his office at 3 a.m. or talking on the phone at odd hours. His carefully maintained appearance, so crucial to his image, showed cracks. A coffee stain on his tie, uncombed hair, stubble, unpolished shoes. The man who told me I'd never be on his level was discovering what his level actually looked like without the invisible support system I had provided. Every small detail I'd managed, every task I'd handled without being asked, every convenience I'd arranged, all gone. Watching him struggle with the basic maintenance of his own existence brought a satisfaction I hadn't anticipated feeling. What Ryan didn't know, what he couldn't have predicted because he had always underestimated me, was that I had been documenting everything. While he was falling apart, I was building an airtight case. I kept a detailed journal in my car, recording every dismissive comment, every time he prioritized his career, every instance of casual cruelty. I had copies of our financial records, downloaded onto a thumb drive Patricia had told me to keep safe, showing how much of my income supported his advancement while my student loans lingered. Screenshots of canceled plans, emails dismissing my concerns. Even a recording from our last attempted marriage counseling session, the one he refused to attend, where the therapist noted his absence. Patricia had reviewed it all. A clear pattern of behavior, she'd said, that will play very well in court, especially given his impending wealth. The revenge I was building wasn't hot and impulsive. It was cold and methodical, constructed with the same careful attention I gave to everything else I did well. Day 15 arrived, a Friday afternoon. My second graders had been dismissed, and I was organizing books when Mrs. Henderson's voice crackled over the intercom, asking me to come to the main office. Her tone was unusual, and my pulse quickened. Had something happened? My parents? Claire? The colorful student artwork in the hallway blurred past as I walked faster. I passed the library, the gymnasium, the sounds of childhood echoing. When I reached the main office, I looked through the glass windows and felt my breath catch. Ryan stood in the lobby, wearing the charcoal gray Tom Ford suit he reserved for important client meetings. In his hands, he held an enormous bouquet of at least 3 dozen roses, wrapped in cellophane with an elaborate bow. He looked completely out of place amidst the elementary school chaos of parent pickups. Children, backpacks, permission slips, conversations at multiple volume levels. Ryan stood in the middle of it all, looking lost and desperate. Mrs. Henderson sat behind the desk, her expression a mix of sympathy and curiosity. Other staff members pretended not to stare, but were clearly watching. I took a deep breath. Something settled over me. Not anger, but clarity combined with purpose. I straightened my shoulders, as if putting on armor, and walked into the lobby with calm confidence. Ryan's face, when he saw me, transformed. Relief flooded his features, quickly followed by desperate hope. He took a step toward me. His suit was immaculate, but his face was haggard, dark circles more pronounced. He lost weight. He started talking before I could say anything, words tumbling out in an uncharacteristic rush. He said he'd been trying to reach me for days, calling and texting, not understanding why I wasn't responding. He held out the roses like a peace offering. He explained he'd been under tremendous stress with the partnership review. He said he might have said some things he didn't really mean. He suggested dinner at Angelo's, the Italian restaurant I used to love. He talked about reconnecting, working through our problems, how much he missed us. The performance was desperate, transparent. I saw the calculation behind his words, the attorney's mind trying to find the right combination of phrases. But I also saw genuine confusion. Why weren't his usual tactics working? Ryan was accustomed to winning, to persuading. I stood there, looking at him, as the lobby grew progressively quieter. Teachers stopped, watching with fascination. Mrs. Henderson abandoned all pretense of working. A group of students sensed something important was happening. When I finally spoke, my voice carried clearly, calmly, steadily through the lobby. Ryan, I said, 2 weeks ago, you established very clear ground rules for our marriage. You said you would decide when we talked. This isn't you deciding we should talk. This is you deciding you want to talk, which is entirely different. I explained that he wanted me available on demand, to come running the moment he experienced even mild discomfort from the consequences of his own choices. That's not how this works anymore, I stated. My voice remained measured, every word deliberate. I wasn't emotional or vindictive. I was simply following the logical conclusion of the rules he had established. Ryan blinked. Genuine confusion crossed his features. In his world, people didn't tell him no. Opposing counsel might argue, but eventually negotiations happened. Clients might have concerns, but he convinced them. His world operated on the assumption that with the right approach, any problem could be solved, any person persuaded. But I was refusing to be persuaded, and he had no framework for understanding why his performance was failing. His confusion quickly transformed into anger. His jaw tightened. His voice took on an edge that made several children take a step back. I am your wife, he spat, as if that fact alone should compel my obedience. He accused me of ignoring him, of being manipulative, of emotional abuse. The accusation was so absurd, I actually laughed. The sound surprised me as much as it seemed to surprise him. It wasn't bitter or cruel, just genuine amusement at his complete lack of self-awareness. I am following your instructions perfectly, I told him. You requested that I stop chasing you, so I stopped. You established that you would determine when we communicated, so I am waiting for you to determine that. You told me I would never be on your level, that you had lowered yourself by marrying me. So I am respecting your superior judgment by maintaining appropriate distance. The logic was airtight. I delivered it with the same calm precision he had used 2 weeks earlier. Several teachers were now openly watching. Sarah, arms crossed. Tom, leaning against the wall. My principal, Dr. Wallace, emerged from her office, ready to intervene, but I also saw something in her eyes that looked almost like approval. Ryan stood there, holding his wilting roses, searching for an angle, an argument, some way to regain control. His mouth opened and closed. Then his voice changed. It dropped to something almost pleading, a tone I had never heard from him. What do you want from me? The question itself revealed how little he understood. This wasn't a negotiation. He started offering concessions like he was in a deposition. He called himself an asshole. He admitted he'd been stressed and taken out on me. He acknowledged he'd said things he shouldn't have. Each admission came out carefully worded, and I saw him watching my face for signs that his strategy was working. He suggested we go somewhere private to talk, like adults, as if privacy would make his casual cruelty easier to forgive. I looked at him and realized something profound. I wasn't looking at the man I had fallen in love with. I was looking at a stranger who happened to wear his face. This person genuinely believed that the appropriate combination of words and gestures could reset everything. He thought he could apologize just enough, promise just enough, perform contrition just enough, and I would return to my role of supporting his life while receiving nothing but contempt in return. The word that came out of my mouth was simple and revolutionary. No, not an explanation, not a justification, not an apology. Just no. I'm not going to dinner with you. We're not going to talk. I'm going to finish my work week and go home to my apartment. I made sure to emphasize that last part, my apartment, the one I had found and rented without his input. I'll enjoy a peaceful weekend, I continued, without walking on eggshells or wondering if my very existence is annoying you. I suggest you leave the school, return to your office, and start getting used to what your life looks like without me managing every detail of it. My voice remained calm. I was stating facts. The information about the apartment hit Ryan with visible force. He actually took a step backward. Your apartment? He said like a question. His face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and then something approaching panic. He protested immediately. We live together. I'm your wife. You can't just move out. He invoked the marital contract, as if it obligated my presence regardless of his treatment. His legalistic mind, so accustomed to controlling situations through contractual language, couldn't comprehend that some things exist outside negotiation. Watch me, I said. Then I turned and walked away, down the hallway, toward my classroom. My sensible teaching shoes squeaked slightly on the polished floor. Behind me, I heard him call my name, a note of genuine panic in his voice, completely unlike his usual controlled tone. He was beginning to understand the full scope of what he had lost. But I didn't turn around. I didn't acknowledge his plea. I just kept walking until I reached my classroom door. I went inside and closed it behind me, leaning against the door, my heart pounding from the confrontation. The classroom was empty, all my students picked up for the weekend. The space felt peaceful in a way our house hadn't felt in months. The walls were covered with inspirational posters about perseverance and respect. I've been teaching my students these concepts every day while failing to apply them to my own life, failing to demand them from my own husband. Student artwork hung on strings, colorful drawings celebrating their dreams. A firefighter, a veterinarian, a teacher like Mrs. Mitchell. That last one always made me emotional. My Teacher of the Year award sat on my desk, a reminder that my work mattered, regardless of whether anyone at home acknowledged it. I sat down, taking several deep breaths. The adrenaline faded, replaced by something steadier, more sustainable. It felt like peace, or at least the beginning of it. I had real responsibilities here. 22 second graders depended on me to teach them, to help them navigate conflicts, to model kindness. And I was good at this work, in ways that had nothing to do with salary or status. My life was finally, gloriously mine again, and it felt incredible. That weekend, I met with Patricia in her downtown office. The building was mostly empty. She was at her desk, surrounded by legal documents, a cup of coffee steaming. She laid out the timeline with the precision of a general planning a military campaign. By Monday morning, divorce papers would be delivered to Ryan's law office. Patricia had specifically selected a process server who specialized in maximizing the public nature of such deliveries. His colleagues would witness him receiving divorce papers at work. By Tuesday, I would change my phone number and block him on every social media platform. By Wednesday, I'd meet a realtor to discuss selling our house. By Friday, I'd sign a lease on my one-bedroom apartment downtown. Exposed brick, large windows, a space entirely mine, free of his memories. Patricia reviewed the financial documentation I'd gathered. Bank statements showing my income supporting his advancement, student loan documents proving my debt taken on for his law school, employment records showing my 2 jobs. She smiled, not kindly, but with the satisfaction of an attorney who knew how to make an opponent pay for their arrogance. Ryan's impending partnership, the very thing he used to justify treating me like hired help, would work in my favor. I had supported him. I was entitled to a significant portion of his increased earning potential. Patricia estimated I'd walk away with enough money to pay off my student loans completely and have a substantial financial cushion. The satisfaction I felt had nothing to do with money itself. It was about justice. It was about Ryan finally paying a price for how he had treated me. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for early November. My second graders worked through a math lesson about addition and subtraction, and I found myself appreciating the metaphor. Adding what you needed to your life, subtracting what no longer served you. At 11:30, my phone buzzed with a text from Patricia, delivered. I excused myself, stepping into the hallway. The divorce papers had been served to Ryan at his office during mid-morning, when the office would be at its busiest. Maximum witness count, Patricia had explained. I imagined his face when he saw the documents, his corporate composure cracking in front of the people whose opinions he valued most. The thought brought a satisfaction that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with justice. He had humiliated me in private. Now, he would experience a fraction of that humiliation in the professional setting he cared about more than anything else. That afternoon, I drove to the phone store. The clerk transferred my contacts and data to a new SIM card. I watched, feeling something significant shift. This new number represented a clean break. Ryan would no longer be able to call or text me. He would try my old number and find it disconnected. One more piece of evidence that I was serious. Back at school, I used my planning period to systematically block Ryan on every social media platform: Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. We had maintained the digital fiction of a happy marriage, posting vacation photos, anniversary messages. I erased him from my social media presence as thoroughly as I intended to erase him from my actual life. Tuesday morning brought a complication I hadn't anticipated. As I walked my students to the pickup area, I saw Melissa, Ryan's sister, near the entrance. She looked upset and disheveled. Melissa, always so polished, had messy hair and hastily applied makeup. She pulled me aside. "What is happening?" she asked, her voice distressed. Ryan had called her in a panic, talking about divorce papers, about me moving out without warning, refusing to talk to him. Melissa admitted Ryan could be difficult, but surely, she suggested, we could work this out if we just communicated. She used the phrase, throwing away 3 years of marriage, as if those years represented some precious investment I should protect regardless of how they had actually felt to live through. I looked at Melissa and decided what I owed her in terms of explanation. She'd been friendly, but ultimately, always her brother's ally. Still, she deserved the truth. I calmly and clearly told her what Ryan had said that Tuesday night. He couldn't believe he'd lowered himself to marry me. I'd never be on his level. He would decide when we spent time together. I watched Melissa's face change. Surprise, then discomfort. She hadn't known the full extent of his cruelty. What Melissa said next shifted something fundamental. She looked uncomfortable, glancing around. Then she told me something I hadn't known. Ryan had been telling their family for months that our marriage was basically over. He'd made a mistake, marrying someone not ambitious enough. He was staying out of obligation, but planned to end things after he made partner because the optics would be better. Melissa had argued with him, told him he was being terrible, that I'd been supportive. But Ryan had dismissed her, just as he had dismissed me. She looked genuinely regretful. The revelation landed with unexpected force. Ryan hadn't just been cruel to me in private. He'd been systematically undermining our marriage to his family for months, constructing a narrative where I was the inadequate spouse holding him back, even as he expected me to cook his meals and manage his life. His shock at my departure was even more satisfying now. He had taken me so completely for granted that he couldn't imagine I would actually leave. He assumed I would always be there, quietly managing his existence. I thanked Melissa for telling me, appreciated her honesty, but made it clear my decision was final. Ryan showed me exactly who he was. I told her, and I chose to believe him. Melissa nodded slowly, processing that her brother had created this situation entirely on his own. By Wednesday evening, Ryan had apparently moved through several stages of responding to the divorce papers. Andrea called me. She'd seen his Facebook posts. I couldn't, having blocked him, but they were visible to mutual friends. Andrea read them to me, her voice barely suppressing outrage. Ryan had posted vague statements about how marriage takes work, how some people give up, how he was learning painful lessons about trust and commitment. The posts were carefully crafted to make him look like the wronged party, the devoted husband abandoned without explanation. His colleagues and friends commented with supportive messages, clearly unaware of the truth. Andrea was furious on my behalf, wanting to set the record straight publicly. But I felt only cold amusement at his transparent attempt to control the narrative. It's a predictable move, I told her. He makes his living shaping stories. I told Andrea the exact words Ryan had used that Tuesday night. I gave her permission to spread that information through our friend group. I was done protecting his reputation. If Ryan wanted to play the victim publicly, then people deserved to know what kind of victim he actually was. Andrea promised she would handle it with discretion. By the end of the week, most of our social circle would know exactly what Ryan had said. I hung up and looked around my new apartment. Boxes still stacked, but it was mine. Every single inch. The systematic dismantling of my marriage was proceeding exactly according to plan. Patricia's timeline was being followed with precision. Ryan's carefully constructed image was beginning to crack, and I was building something new from the pieces of my old life. Something that would be entirely mine. 3 weeks after I served the divorce papers, Ryan showed up at my new apartment on a Saturday morning. I was unpacking the last boxes, organizing my small kitchen, when I heard the knock. I looked through the peephole and my stomach tightened. He was there, holding 2 coffee cups from our old favorite cafe. He looked terrible beyond simple tiredness. His expensive suit hung differently on his frame, suggesting more weight loss. Dark circles had deepened into bruises. His usually perfect hair looked like he'd run his hands through it repeatedly. I opened the door, but didn't step aside. I stood in the doorway, blocking access to this space that represented freedom and new beginnings. His voice, devoid of arrogance, was almost tentative. "Can we talk?" He held out a coffee cup, his hand shaking slightly. I took the coffee but didn't move. He launched into a prepared speech. I was wrong. Partnership pressure said terrible things I didn't mean. He'd started therapy. He understood now how much I'd done for him, how much he'd taken for granted. He wanted to prove he could be the husband I deserved. He was willing to do whatever it took to fix this. I listened, patient, no emotional investment in the outcome. I let him finish completely. Then I asked him the question that had been forming in my mind since talking to Melissa. "Are you trying to reconcile because you actually want to be married to me?" I asked. "Or because your managing partner suggested that a messy divorce right before your partnership decision might reflect poorly on your judgment and stability?" His face changed instantly. A flicker of surprise that I'd figured it out, followed by careful neutrality as his attorney brain tried to formulate a response. He tried to deny it, claiming he wanted me back because he loved me and realized what he had lost. But his delivery completely lacked conviction. His eyes wouldn't meet mine. He had none of the certainty he brought to his legal arguments. I told him I'd already discussed this with Patricia. She had explained how law firms view personal chaos. His sudden interest in reconciliation, precisely 3 weeks after receiving divorce papers and exactly when partnership decisions were being finalized, seemed like remarkably convenient timing. I watched him realize I had seen through his performance completely. The woman he had dismissed as too simple, too low status, had been several steps ahead of him. The realization physically deflated him. His shoulders sagged. I took a breath. "You were right about one thing," I said. "We are not on the same level. But you got the hierarchy completely backwards." I explained that I spent my days teaching children how to read, think critically, treat each other with kindness. I shaped young minds, making actual contributions that would ripple forward through generations. Every child I taught to read gained opportunities. Every conflict I mediated, I was creating adults who might handle disagreements more constructively. "Ryan," I concluded, "my level is just fine. I am proud of my level, and I have no interest in descending to yours, where human worth is calculated purely by salary and status, where love is transactional, where marriage is something you stay in only when the optics benefit your career. I told him the divorce would proceed exactly as planned. Patricia had assured me the settlement would be substantial, given his partnership an increased salary. I had supported him through law school. I was entitled to a significant portion of his earning potential. He, meanwhile, would be learning the expensive lesson that treating people like disposable assets carries real consequences. His face cycled through shock, anger, and then defeat. But he made one final attempt. His voice took on a sharp edge. He warned me that fighting the divorce would be expensive and drawn out, that his firm had excellent attorneys. "You're making a mistake you'll regret." It was a threat disguised as concern. I smiled, the same calm smile I had given him that first morning when I stopped making his breakfast. Patricia was expecting exactly this kind of intimidation tactic, I told him. "She's prepared." I listed my documentation, his verbal abuse, the financial imbalance, him telling his family our marriage was over while expecting me to manage his life. I mentioned the counseling session recording. "Patricia is actually hoping you'll choose to fight the divorce," I said. "It would give her the opportunity to expose his behavior in detail during discovery and depositions. That would create exactly the kind of messy public divorce his firm would view as evidence of poor judgment and instability. The very thing you're trying to avoid by attempting reconciliation would become inevitable if you contest the divorce terms." I watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. He was an attorney. He understood litigation strategy and risk assessment. He realized fighting would cost him far more than money: his reputation, his partnership prospects, his carefully cultivated image. All of it would be damaged. He stood there for a long moment trying to find some angle. But there was nothing left to say. He had played every card, and none of them had worked. He turned and walked away down the hallway without another word. I watched him leave, his shoulders hunched, making him look smaller than he actually was. When he reached the end of the hallway and turned toward the stairs, I closed my door. I stood there, holding the expensive coffee he had brought me. Then I walked to my kitchen sink and poured it out. I didn't need his coffee, his apologies, or his belated attempts at reconciliation. I had everything I needed right here, in this apartment that was entirely mine. I stood in my kitchen for a moment after pouring out Ryan's coffee, looking at the empty sink and feeling something settle inside me. It wasn't triumph, though there was satisfaction in knowing I had handled that final confrontation with complete control. It was more like finality. The last thread connecting us had been severed. Now, only the legal process of making our separation official remained. For months later, that legal process concluded in a conference room at Patricia's office. Ryan and I sat on opposite sides of a polished mahogany table, signing documents that formally ended our marriage. His attorney, Catherine Walsh, a sharp-looking woman, had clearly counseled him not to fight this battle. She reviewed the settlement terms with professional efficiency, understanding her client had no good options. I signed each document as Patricia slid them across the table. The settlement was exactly what Patricia had predicted. Enough money to pay off all my student loans, a substantial portion of Ryan's partnership bonus, which he had received 2 weeks after I filed for divorce, and half the equity in our house, which had sold quickly to a young couple expecting their first child. Ryan looked diminished, smaller than I remembered, as if the past 4 months had compressed him. He had aged, showing the stress, poor sleep, and accumulated weight of consequences he had never anticipated facing. We didn't speak during the signing, except for necessary legal acknowledgments. When his attorney asked if he understood the terms, he said, "Yes," in a voice devoid of emotion. When Patricia asked if I had any questions before finalizing, I said no, and signed the last document with my maiden name, which I had already begun using again. When it was finished, I stood up. Patricia walked me to the elevator. "I wish all my clients handled their divorces with your calm, strategic clarity," she said. "Most people let emotion drive their decisions. You approach this like someone playing chess, not engaging in warfare, and the results speak for themselves." I thank her for her excellent work, adding that I hoped I'd never need her professional services again. We both laughed. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside, turned to see Ryan still sitting at the conference table, visible through the glass walls. He looked lost in a way that might have made me feel sympathy if I hadn't spent 3 years watching him systematically diminish my worth. The doors closed, and I descended to the lobby, walking out into afternoon sunlight that felt warmer than it should have for late winter. 6 months after the divorce finalized, I sat in my apartment on a Saturday morning with coffee made exactly how I liked it, strong and black, nothing to dilute the bitter richness I had come to prefer. My apartment had become fully mine, far beyond legal ownership. The handmade pottery from Margaret's classes filled the open shelves in my kitchen, each piece representing a Wednesday evening spent learning to create something beautiful with my own hands. My books were arranged in an order that made sense only to me. The morning light poured through deep blue curtains I had chosen without considering anyone else's opinion. The space felt calm and peaceful. I still taught at the same elementary school. If anything, the other teachers treated me with additional warmth and respect, as if I had passed some kind of test by standing up for myself. My second graders that year were a particularly delightful group, full of curiosity and energy. I poured energy into my teaching that previously had been diverted into managing Ryan's needs and moods. My lesson plans were more creative, my patience greater, my enthusiasm boundless. The Teacher of the Year award, the spark that ignited everything, now sat on a shelf in my apartment, a reminder that my work had value regardless of whether anyone at home acknowledged it. I had reconnected with old friends and made new ones. My social life now existed entirely on my terms, built around people who added value to my life. My sister, Claire, had become one of my closest confidants. Andrea called me one evening with news she'd heard through the law firm gossip network. Ryan's partnership, which he'd treated as inevitable, had been deferred for at least another year. The managing partners had cited concerns about his judgment and stability during a personally difficult period. The divorce and its circumstances had reached the firm's leadership through channels Ryan couldn't control. They decided he needed to demonstrate sustained professional excellence. The thing he had valued more than our marriage, the achievement he had used as justification for treating me like I was beneath him, had been delayed, partly because of how he had handled our relationship. I felt no satisfaction from this news, which surprised me. I had imagined I would enjoy knowing his actions had cost him professionally. But sitting in my apartment, listening to Andrea, I felt only a distant sense that justice had been served in ways I had not orchestrated or controlled. The universe, it seemed, had its own way of balancing accounts without requiring my continued involvement. I told Andrea I appreciated the information, but I was ready to stop tracking Ryan's life and focus entirely on building my own. She understood immediately. We moved on to talking about other things, and I realized Ryan was becoming what he should have been all along, a person from my past rather than someone who occupied space in my present. Sitting in my apartment, as spring arrived, I reflected on what revenge actually meant. The revenge wasn't in destroying Ryan, though the financial settlement and impact on his aspirations certainly caused him difficulty. The revenge wasn't in public humiliation, though the confrontation at my school and the gossip that followed damaged his image. The real revenge was simpler, more profound. The revenge was peace. Waking up each morning without anxiety about what mood I would find downstairs. Going through my days without walking on eggshells, or monitoring my tone, or wondering if some innocuous comment would trigger an argument. Coming home to silence that felt welcoming rather than tense. The revenge was choosing myself after spending 3 years choosing someone else. Reclaiming the energy and attention I had poured into a person who viewed my love as weakness and my support as entitlement. Understanding that I had always been exactly the right size, exactly the right level, exactly enough. And that Ryan's inability to see that reflected his deficiency rather than mine. I was a teacher who shaped young minds and made differences that would ripple forward through generations. That was enough. That had always been enough. And if Ryan ever figured out what he had lost, the woman who had loved him unconditionally before he taught her that some people don't deserve unconditional love, it would be far too late. The woman he tried to diminish had turned out to be stronger than he ever imagined. She had walked away with her dignity intact and her future bright with possibility, drinking her coffee exactly how she liked it, in an apartment that was entirely hers, on a Saturday morning that belonged to no one but herself. This story of calculated revenge and reclaimed power had you absolutely hooked. My favorite part was when I stood in that school lobby and calmly told Ryan I had gotten my own apartment, watching his entire world crumble in real time. What was your favorite moment of my journey?